Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing one more dupe of the Anastasia Beverly Hills Subculture palette before I'm done with all the dupes. I have reviewed quite a few already, so if you haven't already, definitely go and check out the rest of my eyeshadow palette videos because there are quite a few dupes of this out there. And as the title suggests, today we're going to be reviewing one from the brand called Technic. This is the palette called Shaken Not Stirred, which is obviously a James Bond reference. I have no idea why they thought that this palette has any connection to James Bond, because this is really not a color story inspired by him. So nevertheless, as you can clearly see, these are exactly the same shades that you get in the Subculture palette. And just like with the other palettes from Technic I have already reviewed, one was the Huda Beauty Desert Dusk palette dupe and the other one was the Anastasia Beverly Hills Riviera palette dupe. This one also has the shades in the exact same order as the original palette does. However, because this one has a different layout than the Anastasia Beverly Hills palettes do, it slightly looks different. What I mean is that in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palettes, you have 7 shades in 2 rows and you have 5 shades in 3 rows in this one. So you get one extra shade, which is the Lost shade. Now, as always, one of my eyes today was created using the dupe palette. The other one was using the original one. And as you can see, they do look slightly different, and I'm gonna get into the details of why that is in a bit. But first, let's discuss some basic details of both palettes. So the Subculture palette was a quite controversial palette when it first came out from Anastasia Beverly Hills. Previously, they released the Modern Renaissance palette, which was a very hyped cult favorite eyeshadow palette. Absolutely everyone loved it and really no one could say anything bad about it. So when they released the Subculture, they wanted this to be kind of like a night version of that palette, but some of the shades just really didn't perform the way people expected them to. Now, I don't personally have a problem with the palette I have. However, I did purchase it significantly later than it was originally released. Like I said before, you have 7 shades in 2 rows, so 14 shades in total. As far as the color story goes, it really reminds me of the Mario palette, which was also a very hyped palette. A lot of people loved it because it looked so natural, and I do have the same feeling about this palette. You do get some odd shades like this peachy corally shade or this duochrome green. The shade I like the least in this palette is probably the white one, because it has a really weird gooey texture and it's not actually white. It's almost like a shimmery pink shade when you apply it to the eye. So for me, that's a bit of a bummer. You also get too much shades that are really dry and the performance is not exactly the best, and those are All Star and Axis. Everything else performs quite good. I love this palette. For me, because of those green shades, this is probably still my favorite color story from Anastasia Beverly Hills. I do hope that she's gonna come out with something similar but with better quality in the near future, because I do feel like there is a space in the market for this kind of palettes, just maybe with better execution. But nevertheless, I absolutely adore this palette. I think it's great, but as I said, with some of the shades you're gonna have a harder time to work with. Nevertheless, it's gorgeous. However, this palette has a shocking 6 months shelf life. Now, I picked this up in TJ Maxx, so I believe it was already getting close to its shelf life. And that was 2 years ago, and I'm still using it. I still have no issue. As you can see, there was nothing wrong with the application. So I don't really believe that 6 months. It has 0.7 grams or 0.02 ounce of product in each pens. And like I said, it has 14 pens in total, which gives you 9.8 grams of product in total, which is quite on par with her other eyeshadow palettes. As you can see, the pens are quite small and she doesn't really give you a lot of product, but I've never managed to hit pan on any of them. So I think it's a decent size. You don't really need more than that from an eyeshadow palette. The eyeshadow palette itself was made in the USA, and the brush that comes with it was made in the People's Republic of China. I don't normally keep those brushes. I think most people don't. They are not bad quality though, so if you do need a blending brush, you can definitely use it to blend out your eyeshadow. This eyeshadow palette officially retails for £44, which is on par with her other eyeshadow palette. However, because of all the controversy surrounding this palette, and because it probably being one of her less popular eyeshadow palettes, you can quite regularly find good deals on it. For example, I picked it up for $25 when I was in America, which I believe is about £22 here in the UK. But even now online, I checked it and I found it for £28 on quite a few websites. So it is £44 officially, but you can find it for a little bit more than half of that. Now the Technic palette, on the other hand, contains 15 shades and they have 2 grams of product in each, or 0.07 ounce of product, which is about 3 times of what you get in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette. So this palette in total gives you 30 grams of product, which is huge. It's almost the amount that you would get in a Natasha Denona palette. This palette officially has 36 months shelf life, which is what I would normally use an eyeshadow palette for anyways. It was made in China, but despite not having the cruelty-free logo on it, it does say that they are against animal testing and that the product is vegan. So I don't think that they tested on animals, but it doesn't have the cruelty-free logo, so I'm not 100% sure about that. Now this palette officially retails for £4, but you can pick it up for £2.50, which makes it officially the cheapest eyeshadow palette I have ever reviewed on my channel. As you can see, the packaging is quite generic. It doesn't have the name of the eyeshadow palette itself even. It does have a small sticker on the back and it does say the name of the palette there. And it also comes in this paper outer packaging that also says the name of the palette on the top. So now that we got that out of the way, let's have a look at the swatches of these two palettes. As always, I have the original palette on the bottom because I swatched those ones first, and I have the dupe palette on the top. As you can see, the matte shades are slightly less pigmented. The edges of the swatches are just not as sharp as the original one, but mind you, these are finger swatches, and because Anastasia Beverly Hills is an Instagram brand, they do tend to focus on performing well with finger swatches. So their eyeshadow palettes always look amazing when you swatch them using your fingers on your arm, but then you run into trouble when you actually start using them with brushes and trying to apply them to your eyes. So I must say that the ABH palette outperformed the dupe palette as far as the finger swatches go, but honestly, when you apply them to your eye, that difference completely disappears. I think all of the matte shades performed quite good. I don't really see a difference even just looking at my two eyes. Quite honestly, there was one massive difference, and that kind of made the two eyes appear a lot more different than they otherwise would have been if I didn't use that shade. And that is because of the shade Electric. Now I'm gonna swatch Electric here, and as you can see, this is a duochrome shade. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous duochrome shade. Natasha Denona did something very similar in the gold palette, and Pat McGrath has done similar shades as well. This is basically a green shade with red switch to it. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's a gorgeous, gorgeous duochrome shade that quite a lot of makeup artists like to include in their eyeshadow palettes. Now, this shade wasn't done exactly well by Technic because they replaced it with a lot less shimmery, lot more cocky green shade that is shimmery and has somewhat of a red tone to it, but is just not that. As you can see, it's not as shimmery as the original one, and just the feel of it, the look of it is completely different. If you look at the other shimmery shade in the palette, which is Adorn, Adorn doesn't really have that kind of a duochrome shift to it. So the Technic dupe was able to replicate that quite well. It's probably slightly more brown than the original one, but I would still say that it's quite close. It's just slightly darker and more brown, but they are super, super similar at the end. On the other hand, if you look at the shade Cube, which like I said is a very, very interesting shade because it looks completely white in the pan, and then you swatch it and you get this really chalky, pinkish shade. Absolutely horrible. I probably hate it even more than Huda's glitter shades. It's just horrible and useless. In the Technic palette, they again tried to replicate this shade, but it's not shimmery, so you get a powdery light pink shade. I don't really get this shade in either of the palettes. There's nothing pink about this eyeshadow palette. There's nothing to pair it with. It doesn't really show up anyway, so that shade is just useless. But nevertheless, I still appreciate the one in the Technic palette more, because at least it doesn't have that gooey feeling to it and it doesn't look as chalky. It still looks horrible. I still wouldn't use it, but if you need it for something, I think it's still a lot better than the Anastasia version. And basically what I wanted to show you with these live swatches is that the shimmery shades do have a little bit of a problem. Technic wasn't able to replicate the duochrome in the green shade. They did do a good job with the normal like bronzy gold shade, and they tried to improve on the white shade. It didn't really work, but it doesn't even matter really. So the one shade that I used in today's look and maybe shouldn't have was the green shade, because like I said, that made these eyeshadows look a lot more different than they would have been if I didn't use this green shade, because this is basically the one shade in these two palettes that does look very, very different. If you decide to go with anything else, they are going to look super, super similar because all the matte shades have the exact same tone to them, and I did find the mattes performed really, really well. Let's get into the tutorial of how I created this eyeshadow makeup look, and then I will explain to you the rest during that. So first I started off with the shade Fudge from the Anastasia palette, which is the medium brown shade, and I used this with a blending brush and I really just blended it out on the crease and a little bit on the outer corner. In the Technic palette, I obviously took this same brown shade. The shades don't have a name in this Technic palette, so I'm just gonna describe them to you instead of saying their name. So I took the same brown shade. I had no issue with it. It was performing really, really good. It wasn't patchy. It wasn't grabbing to the skin like the dupe palette matte shades normally do. It performed really, really good. Very, very similar to the original palette. When I was done with the shade Fudge, I went off camera and I did my cut crease. After the cut crease was completed, I started applying Fudge on the outer corner again to basically blend the edges of the concealer, and obviously I used the same brown shade on the dupe side as well. After that I took the shade Destiny, which is the light green shade, and I applied this just on the outer corner of Fudge to make the transition between the green and the brown shade more seamless. I took the shade Electric, which is once again this duochrome green shade, and I must say that the shade Electric has either glitter or just a lot of kickback from this shade, but I ended up having the shade Electric all over my lid, and you can clearly see the shimmery shade reflecting all over my lid. On the other hand, I had no issue with the green shade from the Technic palette. Once again, it's not duochrome, but I feel like it looks a lot more professionally done. So once I was done with Electric, I went back with Fudge and Destiny one more time to blend the shimmery shade together with the matte shades on the outer corner, and I obviously repeated the same thing on the Technic side, again taking the brown and the green shade. And once I was done with this, I took the shade Adorn and I applied it on top of Destiny, and then I went off camera and I finished the rest of my makeup. So once again, this is the finished look. As I said before, the shade Electric doesn't have that duochrome effect to it in the Technic palette, but I kind of prefer that because the fact that Electric transferred all over my lid kind of ruined the look, because when the light shines on it, it's going to reflect, and when it reflects, it brightens up that area. Now, I don't need it to brighten up the outer corner, to brighten up my eyeliner or my lashes. I just feel like I have a lot more contrast on the dupe side. It just looks more flattering. My outer corner is dark, the center of it is bronze, and I have this beautiful light green shade all over my lid. It's reflective enough. So yeah, I personally do prefer the £2.50 eyeshadow palette over the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette. I normally do prefer the dupe palettes over the original ones simply because of the price point. You just save so much money, and I feel like a lot of us only buys into the higher end makeup because we just have this idea that if you're buying from a big brand, a well-known brand that everyone hyped up already, it's gonna somehow magically transfer your whole makeup game. And at the end of the day, if you know how to do your makeup, if you know how to blend out your eyeshadow, this palette will work just as well as the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette would, and you just save so much money. And whilst I love makeup and I do spend a lot of money on it, I have to admit that it's not necessary. There are so many better things to spend the money on. So yeah, if anyone is still interested in getting a good Anastasia Beverly Hills Subculture dupe and for whatever reason haven't purchased one yet or just not happy with the one they purchased, then I think this Technic Shaken Not Stirred palette is a really, really good one. I absolutely love how the matte shades perform in this palette. I think they definitely outperform the matte shades that I had in the Makeup Revolution Reloaded version. So yeah, I think it is a gorgeous little dupe. That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because I would love to have you here. And until next time, take care of yourself. I will see you very soon.